every single professional rugby club in my area had a license deal. We had a kit deal with one of the 4 regions. I had Glamorgan Cricket wearing our kit. I had Cricket Board of Wales signed up to a long-term deal. I had license deals with Gloucestershire and Gloucestershire Cricket. So pretty much everything in my region was locked up, and there wasn't really anywhere else to go. And at the same time, the organisation, I think it didn't want to kind of fall into the trap that other sportswear companies had gone into by trying to buy certain places in the market. So they didn't want to kind of expose themselves too much financially. And that probably would have been the next obvious step for me, given where we got to. So it was kind of the things that I'd been asked to kind of set out to do at the start and re-engage the brand in Wales. By the time I'd finished, we'd very much achieved that. And I still look now and I still see the brand about, and I still see Wales using the products. And I used to set myself a target of seeing the product being worn in public every day.
From Coordinate Sports, it's The Drive Phase, a show about sports founders, leaders and experts and the stories behind their business journeys. Our guest this episode is James Williams, CEO of Welsh Athletics. James is an ex-international athlete and Commonwealth Games team manager. Now CEO of the governing body, he's responsible for driving the infrastructure, participation and elite performance of the sport in Wales. Sport has always been an integral part of James's life. And during the episode, we discuss his childhood growing up in a famous sporting family, his early career in sales with Gilbert Rugby, where he scaled the brand's footprint across Wales and the Southwest. And we also discuss the decision to leave that career behind to follow his passion of helping athletics fulfill its potential. Enjoy the show. I'm delighted to say we have James Williams joining us today. He is CEO of Welsh Athletics, the national governing body of athletics, driving participation and elite success across Wales. Welcome to the show, James.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be on.
Absolute pleasure. I've been really looking forward to this, mate. So where we normally start, I know you quite well, I think. But where we start is trying to let the rest of our listeners into a bit of background story for you and let you get to know them a little bit better. So always start with childhood. If we were going to look back, what would be your earliest sporting memory?
So I come from a really sporting family. So my father played rugby for Wales and the British Lions. My brother, European champion 400 hurdler. My sister ran for Great Britain. Really sporting family. So sport was something we did. Well, now you'd call it physical activity. We were always playing rugby and football and cricket and whatever in the garden as kids and in the local parks. Throughout school, kind of sport was the centre part of it. So
was that tough for you then coming through school, do you think? Obviously with your dad being such a legend, did that kind of set the expectations for you in school?
Do you know what? Certainly during primary school, I was probably blissfully unaware of it. I always remember like my father coming in, was it year 6 last year in primary school, came in and did a few rugby sessions with the team. But apart from that, I didn't really, like I said, blissfully unaware. You become more aware of it as you kind of go through kind of comprehensive school, more because other people bring it up. But for me, I mean, listen, I did a lot of sport. I love my sport. On a national level, I was fairly successful, but my brother was far more successful on an international level. I think the pressure he probably felt of that link and the constant kind of that being brought up all the time was probably far greater than someone like myself. Yeah. Where it was really just more of a local level. And it was more my friends and my teachers, my friends' parents and my teachers who would probably find it more impressive than my friends, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I cut you off then in terms of school life. So you born and raised in Bridgend?
Yeah, Bridgend, kind of the south part of the Welsh Valleys. And yeah, like I said, throughout primary school, rugby was the big game and probably the only sport we played. I remember basketball, but it's primarily rugby. And then I went to a Welsh medium comprehensive called Llanharry. And again, really big sport in school. My PE teacher was a big influence on me and many of the people around me. Again, a big rugby school. I was part of the team that won the Welsh Schools Cup final and all this type of stuff. So I guess I was always part of, sport was always a part of me and I was always a part of sport, I guess.
And that, I guess that lifestyle, that family life of being really active and stuff, was it purely active or was there a lot of competition between kind of sibling rivalry or just in general competitive family?
Definitely rivalry between me and my brother, just as kids growing up. And I'm 2 years older than my brother. And when we're like 13, 14, 12, 13, 14 or whatever, and we're doing racing in the garden and all this type of stuff, and he always beat me and it killed me. But, now I can reflect back. Well, European champion 400-meter hurdler, and I was a distance runner. So of course he's going to beat me. But that was always frustrating.
So coming out of school, really sporty environments, and then did you think that, I'm going to talk about university and things like that, did you always think that sport was kind of where you wanted to have a career, whether in professional sport or kind of in the administration, leadership, management?
Do you know what? No. That being said, I went to university because university had just built an indoor running track, and I didn't really focus on the course. And again, in hindsight, you kind of look back and you think I was very young for my age, probably quite immature for my age going into university, and probably wasn't really ready for university life in the purest form. But I went to university because, like I said, it had this indoor athletics track that had just been built, and I wanted to train. I wanted to use the next 3 years to train as possible. Not that I was kind of this top-class international athlete, but at that age, everyone thinks they can be, don't they?
Yeah,
I never really kind of had these aspirations of working in the kind of sports administration side. And it probably wasn't until I left university that I started to kind of think about what the next phase would look like and kind of found myself working down a certain route.
Because I guess it's one of the things we'll probably talk about in terms of the state of athletics in general, but I guess the theme that we've always spoken about as well on the pod is kind of that, I guess, information or that guidance at the time. So obviously for yourself, coming from a really sporty family, you could see that that's possible. Like obviously your dad had done it, and obviously you've kind of got that inspiration. But a lot of people would go into sport things, especially athletics, thinking, I could make a career out of it. And it's not, even at the top level, it's tough to make a career from athletics, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, as a kind of probably a naive 18-year-old going into university, at the time you're just seeing kind of international athletics on TV and you think you can aspire to that. Because again, there were people from around me who were in that space, and you kind of, you form an impression of what that lifestyle is like. But like you said, the reality is massively different. And also, if you think about it, it was year 2000 when I went to university. And, you think about the growth in the kind of financial rewards in sport. It's accelerated massively in the last kind of 15 years. So 22 years ago, whenever it was that I went to university, rugby had only just turned professional. So you weren't really seeing a lot of kind of rugby players earning massive salaries. So I guess you kind of expected everything at some point to grow. And probably at that point, I probably thought athletics was on that early trajectory towards that as well. But it's just interesting how certain things have grown far faster than others.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously you touched on university. What did you study when you were at uni?
Sports science at university. But again, I didn't really give any consideration to the kind of end goal and as a result, what course I needed to get to that end goal. And it was very much around, what can I do to give myself the best opportunity to train. I then went back to university and did an MBA almost immediately after I finished my degree. And it's funny because I speak to people now, and I always talk about, you must have that plan. I talk to the staff, you must have that plan. Where do you want to get to? And what are the things you need to do to get to where you need to get to? Because I very much had in my mind a plan over the last kind of 10 years. But the 18, 20-year-old that I was had no plan apart from, I want to run this time in the next 12 months. I want this PB. And that was my plan. So life beyond university athletics didn't resonate with me at all. So it was literally about, I'll do sports science because I can learn a bit more about how I can become a faster runner. And that's that. Maybe I'll be a PE teacher or something like that. You know what I mean?
I guess full disclosure, we went to the same university. I was a couple of years after you. I can vouch for the kind of immaturity that you're speaking of.
Thank you.
No, I'm joking. But one of my memories, obviously, we on the same kind of teams and stuff. But I remember you taking kind of leadership role in those kind of almost like team management roles at the time, I guess, as a student. And have you continued that on with Welsh Athletics as well, didn't you? Even before you were in this role you were now.
I think I've always been one of those people who, if I can see things that can be done better, I won't shy away from it. I'll always try to kind of get involved. And I never really never at the time aspired to be, the club captain, the club manager, and all this type of stuff. You kind of just step into it. Mm. I found myself kind of stepping into it because I felt I can do a better job than that person. Well, go on. Then when you put yourself forward, okay, I will. And kind of got me through into team management afterwards. And ultimately, I know we're going to probably talk about this in a bit, but when I kind of faded out as an athlete, I just kind of lost the inspiration to really kind of keep pushing. And I was drifting a little bit. And I kind of took that mantra of, well, okay, Cardiff could be a better athletics club team. Well, go on, be team manager. Okay, I will. And that probably got me back involved in the sport. At that point, I was probably going in a different direction. So again, as much as I talk to the staff about plans and having real clarity on where you want to get to and how you're going to get there, I always talk about these sliding door moments where, you always come across these moments where the decision you make at that moment in time takes your life in a different direction. And I probably had a few of those points, certainly leaving or probably the point of becoming a team manager or team captain in university, which gets you down a certain avenue. And becoming a team manager for my club took me down a certain avenue. And that's probably led me to where I am today from my professional perspective. So, yeah.
So I get talking about them sliding doors, like when you're leaving university at that moment without the distinct plan. Again, what was on the cards? Was it? 'Cause I know obviously in terms of family, Dad was really successful sport-wise, but business-wise as well. Was there an opportunity to go into kind of family business, or what did you look at and think, what's the next step for me? Because oldest son, it might have been ordained like that you should be stepping into these type of roles.
Well, do you know what? It was funny. So I wanted to do, because again, I didn't really have any idea what I wanted to do. And so the only thing I could think of was prolonging the decision by doing a master's. So I went to do a master's in sports science, and for whatever reason, the only one I could get at the university at the time was a part-time master's. My father was like, "No way, you've done 3 years, we're having another 2 years, you start working then." And he just set up a rugby charity, and he literally said, "Okay, well, you can work with this rugby charity for me." But it was very, very basic admin stuff. And then eventually I did the kind of MBA part-time to, I guess at that point I was probably thinking, "Oh God, I do need to think about what I want to do long term." So yeah, so my father, he wasn't very much around, take over the family legacy, take over the family business or anything like that. But he was very much about, if you're not gonna DOS, you're not gonna carry on trying to become a runner, you've got to start working towards a career of some description. And that's something he always instilled into all the kids around, you've got to make it for yourself. You've got to work hard. And he was very clear with me. I'm not paying for a part-time master's for you. You get out and work. If you want to do a part-time master's, you pay for it.
Yeah. And then, so you went on to, because I know you went on to, obviously not just rugby, but working with Grays across a lot of the team sports. How did that come about? And I guess that was, a rep role or sales role, wasn't it, at times? Yeah. Was that maybe a bit of a shock in terms of like quota to hit and get out on the road and make it happen?
Do you know what, right? That's, for me, that was my ultimate sliding doors moment. So I again, trying to figure out what I want to do, I applied to become a development officer at Welsh Athletics. Ironically, working beneath the member of staff who I now manage. So I applied to become a development officer for South Wales, and I get offered the job. Good starting salary job, about 16, 17 grand at the time, something like that. I then get a phone call out of the blue from a gentleman by the name of John Taylor. So John Taylor was, for the rugby fans out there, well, first of all, he was the commentator of the 2003 Rugby World Cup when England won the World Cup. But more from a Welsh perspective, he's one of Wales's greatest ever backrow forwards. And he'd been asked by Grays, who just bought a company called Gilbert Rugby. They needed someone in Wales to become a sales rep. And he phoned me up. He said, because I'd done some work with the rugby charity. Got this role. Are you interested? And I was thinking, I love athletics, don't I? So, of course, I want to be a development officer. I don't want to sell rugby balls and cricket bats and all the rest of it. But my dad was like, you might learn some different skills and, see different parts. You never know where it's going to take you. Do you really want to be a development officer, blah, blah, blah? Nothing wrong with being a development officer, by the way. I do stress that. But I just thought, okay, I'll give it a go. I always had a fascination with the kind of sports marketing and all this type of stuff. So I started off as a sales rep for Grays. I thought I was starting off as a sales rep for Gilbert Rugby because that's how it was sold to me. And when I was handed my cricket samples, I thought, oh God, I better do some research here. And again, I was quite a quiet, bit of an introvert really. So working in sales was alien to me, totally alien to me. But I learned so much from working in sales. I developed within that company. I was there for 9 years. And I went from being quite a shy, introverted individual to being someone who, obviously as sales, you need to put yourself out there, and started to develop kind of strategic thinking and started thinking around, doing the kind of due diligence on what your competitors are doing and what the market's doing, and try to interpret trends and all this type of stuff. And that really set me in the course that I am today. But yeah, so that was my ultimate sliding doors moment. I think back to, whenever it was, 2006, 2007 or something like that. I could have become a development officer and stayed in that little bubble of South Wales and athletics in South Wales. But instead I went down a totally different route and exposed myself to so many different things and learned so many different skills. And that definitely set me up for when I came back to athletics.
Sure. I guess in terms of sales, obviously there's always that pressure in terms of hitting quota and I guess keep finding leads, etc., building. Did you have, I guess when you took that position, you said it was quite a new role or new brand into the region. Were you covering, what was it, Southwest? Sorry, South. The whole.
Yeah, it was like Wales in the Southwest. And again, it was a really fascinating time because the sector as it was then was still fairly traditional, bricks and mortar. And the organisation was a brilliant organisation to work for. Family-run organisation, and that values kind of bled through. They were very much around trying to support traditional retailers who'd supported them for a generation, or more than a generation, 100 plus years. But, they kind of online and kind of online specialists were creeping in at that point. And Wales, as an economy, and certainly South Wales at the time, retailers were closing left, right and centre. I mean, if you think about it now, across South Wales, struggle to find an independent sports shop.
Yeah, and that's one of the things you kind of notice now on the high street. And I remember my time in South Wales, there's a lot of, and probably the infrastructure, like you've got M4, it's like every junction, there's a community there with obviously rugby club, athletics track, local, independent. And now you've got just consolidated everywhere, and it's just like Sports Direct, I guess. And then the online players. Was that difficult to watch then? Because you're on the thick of it, and this is your contact list and contact book. You're going and visiting, and then struggling with it. Yeah,
absolutely. And you're looking at, like you said, you're given a sales target, a product or sales figures to hit based on the retailers you had last year. And you're looking at your retail list, and you're thinking 25% of them have gone, and the other 25%, another 25% are really struggling, and everyone else is chasing this last 50%. So the market's getting squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And as much as we had a solid brand, we were quite traditional at the time. We were very traditional in what we were trying to sell. It was very much hardware. And I had to diversify away from that, because ultimately, if I've only got 50% of my stores that I had last year, trying to sell the same level of product, I'm never going to hit those targets. And you're new in the role. And as anybody who starts new in sales, you've got to prove yourself. They can't afford to carry you. And I very much felt that pressure, albeit the organisation was so good, they probably would have carried me. But I had that kind of self-drive, wanted to hit my figures. So I knew we had to diversify. I started kind of having a look at teamwear, sports clothing, which is something which the brand at the time wasn't really that interested in. But I started to see the fruits of that. And I started to see huge growth in sales around that. And not only that, you're opening yourself up to a totally different sector of retailer. And sales started going through the roof. And over time, the organisation very much started to focus on that. And probably a lot of the growth that it's seen over the last kind of 10, 15 years is probably in that kind of teamwear sector as opposed to the traditional hardware. So it was really fascinating kind of going through, seeing the change in the sector and seeing how the brand I worked for kind of evolved and other brands around us evolving. And it got me. I talked a little bit about kind of a mantra I kind of carry through everything. I want to know everything about my competitors. So in this sector I now work in, I want to know everything about the other sports. So I want to know what they're doing, and I want to know why they're doing it, trying to identify trends in the market. And I started to develop that when I was working in the sports section, in the sports sales sector, where you look at the price points and what people were selling, and the type of color schemes they were using, the materials they were using, and teams that they were chasing, and how they were trying to get their product to market. And you try to apply that, or at least feed that into the overall sales strategy.
So with really successful over that period of time, you said you were there for like 9 years. I guess a couple of questions in terms of moving on. How obviously must have been a difficult decision, and what was the kind of distance travel? So from when you started, like you said, not a challenger brand because it's really well known, but to where you left, what was the kind of, we always like to know figures and stuff like that. So in terms of like the size of the business and stuff like that.
Yeah, it was nearly tenfold in growth. It was nearly tenfold in growth. It was it was fantastic, the level of growth financially. But I think what more importantly for me, when I started, the brand didn't really have a presence in Wales. From a rugby perspective, it didn't really have a presence in Wales. They just lost the national contract, and it had gone through a lot of change prior to
What was the brand? What was the competitor then? Because I always think, I can only ever think Gilbert when I think about rugby. But so, what was the?
So a company called Webb Ellis had signed Wales just before we started, a very, very long-term contract. And I always reflect when I left, and I wasn't looking to leave, and I'll come on to why I left in a little bit. But when I left, we'd signed the WIU to a long-term contract that locked in kind of pretty much all the clubs. Every single professional rugby club in my area had a license deal. We had a kit deal with one of the 4 regions. I had Glamorgan Cricket wearing our kit. I had Cricket Board of Wales signed up to a long-term deal. I had license deals with Gloucestershire and Gloucestershire Cricket. So pretty much everything in my region was locked up, and there wasn't really anywhere else to go. And at the same time, the organisation, I think it didn't want to kind of fall into the trap that other sportswear companies had gone into by trying to buy certain places in the market. So they didn't want to kind of expose themselves too much financially. And that probably would have been the next obvious step for me, given where we got to. So it was kind of the things that I'd been asked to kind of set out to do at the start and re-engage the brand in Wales, by the time I'd finished, we'd very much achieved that. And I still look now and I still see the brand about, and I still see Wales using the products. And I used to set myself a target of seeing the product being worn in public every day. That was my mantra. If I can get to the point where I can see someone wearing it every day, then I know the brand's getting out there. And to this day, I still look around and I still see it being worn. Obviously, that was 10 years ago for me. So the guys who came in after me have done a far better job in taking it on. But yeah, it's that pride of seeing something flourish and continue to flourish.
Yeah, for sure. So it's almost like, I guess at that period, you kind of achieved everything you set out to, or you maybe put a bow on it. I mean, sounds like you set the guys up, whoever replaced you, with a pretty, they've walked into a pretty nice situation where everything's sewn up on long-term deals. So I'd take some credit for that if I was you. But yeah, what was the catalyst for you to move on? And was it straight into Welsh Athletics from Grays, right? Or was it?
Yeah. So, I talk about, I can't sit there and see something happen and not, okay, I'll do that. Well, a role came out. It was on less money than I was earning at the time, so my wife-to-be wasn't particularly happy. And, probably I was one of these people who would sit there and go, oh, bloody Welsh Athletics, why aren't they doing this or why aren't they doing that? And, they should be doing more of this and more of that and blah, 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 blah. And this role came out and I thought it was a head of operations role. And I thought, well, blow me, I can't sit here and say Welsh Athletics should be doing this, that and the other, and then not put myself in a position where I can help influence that. So that's what I did. I applied for the role purely because I want to see the sport flourish and I want to see the sport develop. I certainly didn't take the role for the money because, when you leave the kind of sports trade and the potentials on that to come into the governing body sector, yeah. So it was very much about wanting to contribute, wanting to influence positively, and wanting to make an impact on the sport that I love in the country I love, I guess.
And going to talk about kind of what things look like when you first arrived at Welsh Athletics versus now, and kind of distance travel. I'm really curious about the deal structures as well, in terms of, like you said, in terms of what you'd done with Grays and how you'd locked down some of the, basically most of the market that you were looking for, the clubs and the NGBs, etc. Is that approached differently in terms of from the other side? So from Welsh Athletics, what kind of deals were in place? I don't know if that was your remit when you first started there. It probably is now. But that commercial side.
Yeah, do you know what? It's really funny. So I'm sure there are lots of people who are part of rugby clubs who listen to this podcast, but rugby clubs aren't the best at paying their bills, quite frankly. And I used to find myself, along with obviously my competitors from the other brands, chasing clubs up and down the country, trying to get them to sign up and, putting deals on the table and all this type of stuff. And then lots of clubs not paying and all this type of stuff. But there's always someone there who's throwing a deal on the table. So then I come into Welsh Athletics, I come into the governing body, financially incredibly stable, are a type of organisation, and all governing bodies like this, that will pay their bills on time. That is an organisation that is always looking for growth, so is always looking to expand its membership. And yet the door never knocks. Most governing bodies, I'd imagine, are having to go to brands, are having to go to businesses. Certainly governing bodies the size of ours are having to, or certainly over the first half of those years, you're having to chase the brands. I found myself thinking that I'd be on the other side of the table and people would be selling to me. And I found myself having to sell the brand.
That's really interesting. Why do you think that is then? Because is it just the footprint of, I guess, obviously rugby, but I'm assuming, I don't know if you've got more members than rugby, maybe not, but in terms of the membership, it must be huge.
Yeah, I mean, the membership's strong, certainly stronger than most domestic clubs, rugby clubs, obviously. But for whatever reason, athletics as a sport, from an apparel perspective, park the kind of footwear side, because that's huge and it continues to grow at exponential rate. But from a kind of clothing perspective, the likes of Adidas, Nike, etc., we're too small for them. You can take out the large chunk of the kind of major athletics providers in the market. And then who else is there? You've got a lot of the kind of smaller brands who, for whatever reason, don't see teamwear. I'm talking purely from a retail perspective. Don't see teamwear and athletics as a focus for them, which for the life of me, I cannot understand. Because, as I said before, these guys, every athletics club has got funds, so paying a bill is never a problem. They've got large memberships that are growing all the time. If I was working in the sportswear trade now, that's what I'd be chasing, because you'd get huge growth, you get quick payment. Yeah, and it's just, for whatever reason, it's an untapped market and it hasn't gone, people haven't caught up with it yet. And I still see huge amounts of kind of rugby brands starting up all the time who are chasing small clubs in the dream of building their brand into the next big thing. And more often than not, they disappear after 1 or 2 years because the model relies on payments being made quickly. It just doesn't happen.
But I was going to say, because I remember my time, I remember, this is going back years, 10, 15 years, I remember that, and at that time, it was a really a challenger brand new startup kind of, because Welsh Athletics had the deal with Under Armour, didn't they, all the way back then? And is that what you're trying to say in terms of maybe they got too big and now Welsh Athletics is too small for that type of deal? Because Under Armour's huge now, right? So I guess you'd be looking for a Gymshark or someone to come in before they get too big, or maybe they're too big already.
Yeah, what I find is that the retail brands, they're obviously, they need to keep their brand fresh. So some of them 2, 3, 4 times a year bringing out new ranges. Now, from a teamwear perspective, what I want for Welsh Athletics, I want the same kit for 2 years, 3 years.
Right.
And I want the same design, because you run for Wales this year, you run for Wales next year, but I run for Wales for the first time next year. I want you to have the same kit. I want to have the same kit. And if it's fully bespoke and you're having to get product made by design, then we're obviously having to invest massively up front and work on really long lead times. So you want to work with companies who kind of have big stock levels and consistent stock levels. And a lot of the brands like Under Armour, they probably do have a team around now, but at the time, we could never get 2 vests that looked the same because they'd be changing their range so often.
Right, understood.
That's always the challenge. I have the battle sometimes now still with the athletes who, they want to see these kind of really cool hip brands, and they understand why we haven't got them. And I try to make it clear, their business model doesn't align with our business model, and it would put financial and kind of pressures on us that they wouldn't understand, and quite frankly they wouldn't care about. But at the same time, it means we don't necessarily get the kit that they want, which is always a challenge. That being said, we are working now with a really strong brand, Joma, a really strong brand, who the kit's really, really good, really positively received. And more importantly, their model allows us to do the things that we want to do. They hold massive stock levels for us and just enable us to plan far, far easier.
So strong partnership there. Like, sounds like a strong long-term partnership already set up. So just going back to that question in terms of your day one in Welsh Athletics, obviously you've been on the sidelines, probably drawn up a list of things you're not happy about, etc. I guess, what did you find when you first landed? And is it kind of you get all the information then and realise why people couldn't make the changes that you thought were so easy from the outside? Yeah,
because you very quickly realise that the want and need of a governing body isn't just to ensure that the clubs are performing well, or the athletes are performing well. The demands on us, certainly for a sport like athletics, is huge. It's so vast. So we've got everything from social running, trying to get people physically active, couch to 5K. Physical literacy, trying to get people just to learn competent movement skills, alongside the requirement for strong and robust governance, obviously strong and robust safeguarding, the need to drive equality and diversity across all aspects, coach education, coach development, official education, officials development. And you've been asked to do all of these things. Huge numbers of things. And I learned this very, very early on. And you've been asked to do it with limited resource. And as a result, because, relatively small budgets, albeit the budgets have grown, relatively small budgets. And you've been asked to do all of these things whilst at the same time, develop core aspects of the sport, competition.
I say win some medals as well, I guess, as well.
Yeah, exactly.
On top of it, yeah.
So you quickly realise that most governing bodies, and certainly Welsh Athletics at the time, all they can do is be really good at keeping the plate spinning. And you then very quickly begin to realise why people get frustrated that things aren't moving very quickly, because the capacity just isn't there to do it, still isn't there to a certain extent, to move forward the areas that you want to move forward. And the other thing, which having come from the kind of commercial sports sector where things move really quickly, it's really dynamic. A product sells, you do more of it. The product isn't selling, you get rid of it. You come into this sector and it moves so slowly. So slowly, and the ability to influence change quickly is so limited because of keeping the plate spinning, and in many instances don't have the authority, even in a senior leadership role, you don't have the authority to just do something and make a decision. You need to ensure that the sport is engaged and consulted, and the governance is part of that decision-making process, which ultimately does mean you have to move quite a lot slower, because you're trying to take a large group of the community with you.
That's one of the things with the community as well, because like you said, we'll get onto kind of the financial model of the governing body, but it's volunteer-led, right? Like most sports anyway, volunteer-led, mentioned officials, volunteers. So for you to make change, obviously everyone's got to be on, or at least the majority has to be with you with it. Is that one of your biggest challenges at the moment then, in terms of here across other sports, but officials, volunteers, recruiting and retaining them? Has that been a challenge, and also bringing them on with your, plans for the future?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different challenges there. I mean, I think most people at the moment in our sport, certainly the traditional parts of our sport, track and field, etc., they kind of want everything to change without changing anything. That's how I see it. They recognise change is needed, but don't try to change anything for them.
Right.
So you're almost in this position where you're trying to present the rationale for change, and they get that. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've got to change shorter competition days. More athlete-centered, less pressure on officials, but just don't change anything that I'm involved with. Don't change my league. Don't change my event. Don't change my club. And that will never work. You're always going to clash at some point. And that's the toughest challenge. Is sometimes you need wholesale change and kind of drive a kind of sledgehammer to crack a nut type of thing. And sometimes you need gradual change, and it's trying to have that blend. And I think ultimately what you have to do is create a critical mass and give a sound rationale for change, which comes about through large engagement, and try to engage the community through the rationale for change and try to take them through the classical kind of managing change model. But the last 2.5 years has kind of accelerated the need to change in certain aspects, because lots of people, lots of officials, lots of coaches, lots of club volunteers have found other things to do on a Saturday and Sunday, or they don't want to go to the track 5-6 nights a week to support their club, or they want to spend more time with their family, with their grandchildren, which of course you totally understand that. But when you've got a limited group of volunteers, certainly around kind of technical officials, you've got a limited group of volunteers, incredibly passionate, incredibly supportive, who give up huge amounts of time, and you lose a large chunk of that. It'll take us such a long time to replace them. So we're in this point now where we're having to play catch-up. But the worry is we'll never quite catch up, because we were playing catch-up anyway. Now we're starting further behind. So to catch up, you've got to do one or two things. You've either got to, miracle up a tenfold increase in volunteers and develop them really quickly and get them to engage really, really quickly. Or you've got to reduce the amount you're trying to deliver. So we're in this post-COVID, we're in this kind of big challenge where we probably have to drive more activity to try to generate interest in our sport, to try to get the sport back up and running as quickly as possible. But that goes totally against this absolute need to reduce what we're doing, because we don't have the volunteer workforce has the capacity to move it forward. And that's the big challenge that we're facing. And I'd imagine that's a big challenge that lots of sports are facing. And certainly one of my reflections on how we as an organisation have tried to achieve some of that is we as a group of staff have been far more hands-on. So when the restrictions started to ease, in that first summer, pretty much every competition was delivered by our staff. And our competition staff is 3 people. And you're asking them to deliver this mountain of work. And they've done it. They did an amazing job of doing that, because ultimately it was our responsibility to do all we can to get the sport back. But then how do you hand those competitions back?
Yeah.
How do you get back to that previous model? Well, you can't, especially if many of those competition providers aren't there. So in many aspects, we've made a rod for our own back, and we're now looking at it going, well, we either have to put more resource into it ourselves to keep that going, but can we afford to do that? Doubtful in many instances. Do you try desperately to hand it back and almost force it back on people? Major challenges with that. Or do you say, we have to stop doing some things then? So we're constantly wrestling, post-COVID, we're constantly wrestling with those challenges. And that's around competition. You can replicate that around officials education. You can replicate that around coach development. You can replicate that around our performance program. You can replicate that around kind of club development. There's so many things that we've had to step into, because we felt it was our responsibility as a governing body to do that, because nobody wants to develop the sport more than we do. But by doing that, and the pace we've done that, we've created different challenges that we now as an organisation, and more importantly as a group of staff, are having to deal with. And as the chief exec, the constant topic I'm having with my leadership team is around staff wellbeing. Right. How do we keep these staff
from getting burnt out? Or
yeah, absolutely.
I was going to say, from the outside looking in, I guess, like going on your website, it looks like you've got a really strong team, quite larger than would be expected. Is that, I'm going to go on to kind of the model, and I know you've always had kind of a mission or set out to diversify income streams, right? So make sure you're not just reliant on the funding that maybe is just handed down, I guess, in Sport Wales. What's the kind of the model in terms of, I guess, the split of how you generate funds and manage that team? Because obviously it's going to be getting strained, like everyone is at the moment. But
yeah.
How do you keep that going, and what's the split?
Yeah, so the kind of 3 or 4 years leading into COVID, probably if you'd have asked me, what's the biggest risk to Welsh Athletics, I probably would have said Sport Wales funding, central government funding, because we were, everyone was going through austerity at that point, and we were seeing kind of top slicing on funding every year. And as a result, you've got to manage the risk. We run a risk register. That's top of your risk register. What are you going to do to manage the risk? So we have to start 4 or 5 years ago. We started a process of diversifying our income streams and looking at different ways that we can generate income and having value in our product. I'll come on to that a little bit in a second, because that's something that as a sport we struggle with. But of course, when COVID hits, those governing bodies who are less reliant on Sport Wales funding are probably more at risk, because we were circa 65% of our total budget reliant on Sport Wales, but that other 35% disappeared overnight.
Yeah, true.
Whereas, there are certain governing bodies in Wales, some of the smaller governing bodies, who might be, 90%, 95% reliant on Sport Wales funding for their total budget. Well, then they've almost got total security during that period. So, we went through all of these kind of aspects, went through all of these kind of waves of emotion where, you pride yourself on being able to manage this key risk of central funding, but then you find yourself with that being a big liability for you and having to manage that other challenge, which, in fairness, we did. And again, in total fairness to Sport Wales and Welsh Government, they were always there to support us through that journey, support all the governing bodies through that. So it was never, became aware very quickly that there wasn't a risk. But this mantra of us wanting to grow, I want to grow as a sport, I want to grow as an organisation, and I want the staffing cohort to grow. I want us to have a more diverse resource that we can move the sport forward. So you can't just sit there and rely on central government to, you've got a really good program or product, I want to invest in that, because the pie will never get bigger. It's more likely going to get smaller. So if we want to do those things, we've got to start generating more of our own income. And of course, by generating more of your own income, you have far much more freedom on how you invest that. Because with government investment, obviously, you have to deliver against certain criteria. So as a sport, we had to look at what are the aspects that we can go into. We identified 3 or 4 different areas. So we established a physical literacy program called Starting Blocks, which we sold as a franchise model, and that's gone on quite well. We established a virtual club, a virtual running group, and all this type of stuff to engage with the social running community, but then also to try to generate more income. Put on far more commercially focused events, and obviously try to align ourselves with other commercial providers and many other kind of smaller aspects that we did that were very much focused on income generation, commercially focused. But when I kind of was tasking a lot of the team with kind of coming up with some of these models and coming up with kind of pricing structures, it was noticeable that, the default position was free or incredibly cheap. And I'd be very blunt with someone and say, do you value this product then? Is this product going to be any good? This product's going to be brilliant. But if it's so good, why are we charging £2 a session for it? When, I take my kids to rugby tots and all-star cricket and blah, 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 and swimming and all this type of stuff, and you're constantly handing over kind of £6, £7, £8, £9, £10 a session. Because if you give someone a really good experience, they're happy to pay for that experience, Yeah. And at the same time, if you're paying for something, you will expect a good experience, and your expectations on what your customer wants goes up, and you tend to find people will kind of give that positive experience because I want you to pay me £10 next week, etc. So we
also the other way as well. It also goes back the other way as well. If it's cheap, it can be seen as not as good. Like
yeah,
exactly. It's only £2. Exactly. Maybe they're not quite sure what they're doing or what have you. And price set, especially on kids' activities, like with Starting Blocks, awesome program, fantastic program. And where it's aimed at the under 9s, you've got the price sensitivity for parents is so. I guess, like you said, you're taking your kids to sessions, probably out checking the price before you take them. You just know you want to take them there or they want to go there.
Definitely. So
you've got a huge opportunity there, especially with having the authority of being Welsh Athletics behind it.
No, exactly. And if ultimately, if you charge £1 a session and people still don't turn up, so you reduce it to free and people still don't turn up, where'd you go? Do you stop paying people to turn up? So, and don't get me wrong, we have the social responsibility, and as part of any commercial kind of setup for us, in areas of social deprivation, we can deliver free activity because we're getting our own income generated in other parts of the country that enables us to do the things that we want to do and ensure that everybody has these opportunities. And we work with partners to achieve that. But having value in our product is and trying to instill that into the staff, that if we've got a good product here and we really think it's a good product and we really think people will benefit from being engaged with this product, we shouldn't be afraid to put a value on that product, because we're not a commercial organisation. Any income we generate goes back into building the sport, goes back into creating opportunities in areas where they maybe can't afford to do it. goes back into building the infrastructure for the sport. And trying to get that embedded in the mentality within the team is a challenge and continues to be a challenge. It's not just internally. I think the sport probably suffers from the mentality as well, where there probably is this expectation that it should be free or very, very cheap to deliver. And yet we wonder why facility providers balk at the idea of spending £500,000 to relay a track when they're not getting any money in for it. So we as a sport have a responsibility to show our worth to the community, to show our worth to invest back into facilities, to invest back into the sport. And we have to pay our way to a certain extent. And, we invest directly into facilities as a governing body. And we do so because if there's a new pole vault bed needed in a track in mid-Wales, with the greatest of respect, the only people who really want that pole vault bed is the athletics community. With the track and with the infield, potentially there's other users that can engage with that. But with the core aspects of the sport, it should be us that make the strong case. And in many aspects, I feel it's our duty to invest into those facilities to ensure that those aspects of the sport get upgraded. And it's, again, that was a big shift in culture and mentality within the sport. But you had a situation where maybe the local authority, the facility provider, wasn't willing to spend £10,000 on a new bed. But if we're coming in offering to pay £3,000-4,000, you often find that they find the rest. And for every pound we've invested, we've had at least £4 of private investment going into that. So that's us understanding that we need to contribute and we need to play a wider role in investing into our community as well.
Do you feel like with the challenges you were talking about before in terms of change and I guess a slow pace of change and getting people on board and adoption of that athletics has effectively been left behind by other sports? So, and also I know you said you really research on all the other areas. Like, is there a sport that you look to say like, well, if they're managing to achieve that, surely athletics should be on par or exceeding them? Do you know what I mean? No disrespect to any other sports, but you're talking about like the fundamentals of every sport, like this, it's blue ribbon event, Olympic, everything like that, everything that goes along with it. Do you feel like there's maybe a bit of a lost time, not just with COVID, but like in general in terms of development or growth of the sport?
Yeah,
it comes along with turmoil. I know, like wider than that, athletics could be said is like in a bit of turmoil in the country, etc.
I think the perception is this. I think the perception is the sport's been in turmoil for a while. I do think it's got an image problem. Largely, it's not necessarily the fault of the sport. So every time there's a story about drugs, if it's nothing to do with athletics, if you go on the BBC Sports page, it's on the athletics page. And
I didn't realise
many times it's not an athletics matter. But again,
you're right though. You're right. In terms of coverage, you don't do ourselves any favours in terms of like sport. You might tune in to watch some athletics, and if there was a drug scandal, they'll do 20-minute piece at the start, at the top of the show, talking about it.
Yeah. I mean, it is frustrating. Our sport, it has some incredible athletes, some incredible people involved in our sport. We're going through a golden age of middle distance running at the moment, probably on a par with the Coes and Obets. Maybe not necessarily getting the medals, albeit we did get 2 middle distance medals in the Olympics. But the sheer depth of people who are running sub 145 for 800 for men, the Gemma Rickey and Laura Muir and Keely Hodgkinson in the 8 and 1500. We've got some incredible talent, but for whatever reason, we can't cut through into mainstream media with that in the same way that maybe football and rugby can. But we've got those personalities. I mean, Dina Asher-Smith, everybody should know Dina Asher-Smith. She is the kind of, if you were to define... Most
marketable athlete.
She's an incredible athlete, incredible person, incredibly intelligent. She should be the most marketable athlete out there. But for whatever reason, we can't quite cut through onto the mainstream. But as a sport, I think we're nearly there. And I know there's been a lot of kind of change in British athletics, but I get to see a slightly different thing. I do see the passion and I do see the effort being made by all the governing bodies to improve the sport. And it comes back to this, the need for change and the ability for change. I think everybody in our sport understands that it needs to modernise in certain aspects. It needs to change the delivery model, certainly around some of the more traditional aspects of the sport. But it's so difficult to take a large group of volunteers who are so staunch in the tradition of the way the sport's delivered. It's so difficult to take everybody with you. And as a result, you end up in constant conflict. But ultimately, everyone agrees that change needs to happen. But it's just the way we try to change sometimes leads us in a very difficult way. And also, I think it's important to remember the term athletics, it's a hybrid term. I mean, athletics represents 30 different sports, right? Pole vaulters and marathon runners, they're totally different. Shot putters and high hurdlers, totally different. But they're all under this term athletics. And it's, if you think how difficult it is for any athletics governing body to be able to develop all of those event groups at the same speed and with the same level of resources, it's nigh and impossible. But we're all trying, but some will obviously develop at different speeds than others. And also remember, we have 460 licensed running events in Wales every year. So more than one a day. And that doesn't include 70 park runs every Saturday and Sunday. So all of that activity is going on. And all of that activity is bringing new people into the sport. But when you and I are talking about athletics, we're probably talking about a certain part of the sport. It's probably talking about track and field. But in Wales, we've got 14,000 members, 116 clubs. But I know there's 420,000 people running every week in Wales.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to do all we can for the 420,000 people, trying to do all we can for the 116 clubs, trying to do all we can for the 14,000 members, the 2,500 coaches. It's just so difficult to get that balance right, where everybody feels as if they're getting the support and the investment and the pace of change happens across all those aspects. It's a big challenge. And scale that up for England,
but then also I guess those points of recognition as well, like you've got all that activity going on all the time, points of recognition, like we've got Commonwealth Games coming up now a couple of months' time. That's obviously the biggest one in terms of elite level. Do you feel like that you're able to harness that? Obviously, you must have loads of plans coming up in terms of like this spotlight's going to be put on things, especially being a home games and stuff. What are the plans, and is that the strategy to use that to kind of raise awareness in a positive way? Yeah,
so one of our key strategic aims was to raise the profile of our athletes, and we've worked hard on a Welsh level to get the likes of Jeremiah Razoo, our lead sprinter, to get as much kind of coverage as possible. Jake Hayward and Melissa Courtney, to get these athletes, to get young kids aware of who these athletes are. So lots of school visits, lots of engagement, lots of kind of local news stories, with the hope that when they get to the Commonwealth Games, the majority of the Welsh public know who Jeremiah Razoo is. They know who Melissa Courtney is. They know who Osian Jones is. That's our number one challenge, is to get to raise the profile. And then also, another one of our key kind of strategic objectives, everyone laughs when I say this, but it's a true and honest one that I genuinely believe we can do, is to get 100% of schools engaged in athletics, in some form of athletics or running activity. So we're doing lots of activities with the Daily Mile, doing the Queen's Baton Relay, trying to get schools to, run the distance from where their school is to Birmingham and all this type of stuff. And lots of things around physical literacy, and with the Starting Blocks programme going in, delivering the sessions into schools. And that's what our focus is. Because if you think about it, at the same time, every school has a sports day. And what's a sports day? It's an athletics competition.
Yeah, I was just about to touch on that. Yeah, you want to be. Yeah.
So 100% of schools being involved in some form of athletics or running initiative. It shouldn't be too difficult, because we want to get every school to not just deliver a sports day, but to deliver a sports day that everyone has a positive experience on, and who hopefully is the catalyst for individuals to get involved in our sport in some capacity. Very simplistic, I know, but we have to look at it that way. We have to look at what are the unique aspects of our sport that no other sport can draw on, and delivering the fundamental movement skills that Starting Blocks will get to get everybody competent at run, jump, throw. It should be a core part of the national curriculum. Daily Mile, getting people physically active, should be a core part of the national curriculum, and getting people engaged with our sport as early as possible it stems from a lot of that. If we can get people to know that, running as a form of physical activity, jogging as a form of physical activity, can lead them into a sporting pathway, which isn't necessarily about performance. There's a massive social running community in Wales that's really supportive and really engaging. If that's where people find themselves from school in that community, and they get a positive experience from that, and they get positive change from that, brilliant, our job's done. That for us is just as important as someone entering a performance pathway that takes them from schools all the way through to Commonwealth Games.
I know you mentioned the kind of social running aspect and your background as middle long distance runner. What are you doing nowadays in terms of how you stay on top form in terms of like physically, mentally? Are you out running every day? What's the mileage look like at the moment?
Do you know what? Do as I say, not as I do.
You've got young kids as well, so yeah.
Yeah, that's the excuse.
Exactly, use that one.
I don't run as much as I like. Every year I set myself New Year's resolution to get more physically active and to do more running. I've spits and starts on it, but yeah, it's one of these things. I do feel terrible. I sit down and I talk to all day, every day about the need for improved physical activity, and I don't live it myself. That being said, we have a long chat about, talk about the staff well-being and establishing run club in the staff on a Friday afternoon, within the staff on a Friday afternoon, to get out and just have a chat while we run, and that's what I need, and that will get me into it. But yeah, I mean, just little things. I started doing the cold water therapy, so cold shower every night. I've been inspired by
Wim Hof. I was going to say running and having a chat while you're running is already better than that, because I can't speak to anyone if I'm jogging. So that's a good idea. But I mean, in terms of like leading the organisation, a lot of moving parts, and like you explained, loads of different priorities, juggling all the plates, etc. Is there anything that you kind of always go to when to try and stay on top of things, like not get too overwhelmed? There's always things happening, challenges being thrown at you, etc. Have you got any kind of working practices or approaches that you have to manage all that?
I try. I say this to the senior team as well. Every 2 weeks, I try to start my day either in the kitchen in my house when the kids have gone to school, or in a coffee shop, or in my office with just a blank piece of paper, and just give myself some thinking time. And I always try to kind of jot down some of the key challenges I've got on facing, or some of the key priorities over this next period. I am a very structured person, very analytical, very structured person, and I do like my lists, and I do try to build in that thinking time, which is so important because everyone's so busy, especially during COVID. Everyone's so busy. If you don't find that space, that thinking time space to reflect and to process, then you're in this hamster wheel. You never get off it. So yeah, it's something that I desperately try to do. I am quite a reflective person, and I'll often just kind of, where we're based, where our offices are based, there's a track there. I'll often just lunchtime, I'll just go and just walk, just to think, just to process. Yeah, and I think that's probably the way that I manage everything that I need to manage. Yeah,
definitely. That's stepping back a little bit, isn't it? And working on it rather than being in the thick of it all the time.
Yeah, being as reflective as you possibly can. And I mean, COVID, obviously, we were all kind of working from home during COVID. And at the time, I had a 1.5-year-old that I was home, that I was looking after while I was trying to work. And every lunchtime, I had to take him for a walk in a pram, mainly to get him to go to sleep so I could work for the next 2 hours. But that requirement to go out of the house and to walk and to get that fresh air without my phone, without emails, was probably the thing that got me through most days in COVID. And because it just gives you that thinking time, gives you that opportunity to process, gives you that opportunity to reflect on the decisions you've made, or more importantly, how you've kind of been acting over that period, and maybe how you're responding to your team and all this type of stuff. And yeah, that's probably my number one coping mechanism, I guess, is finding that space.
I love that one.
To process and to think.
Great advice. Last question for me. We talk about reflecting. We always ask all of our guests if they could, if you stumbled across a time machine, you can go back and talk to yourself when you were the younger version of yourself, maybe just starting out at university or just leaving, starting your career. Is there a piece of advice that you'd go back and give yourself, just one piece of advice?
Yeah, difficult one. Only one?
Well, yeah, if you got more than one, but yeah, no, just one.
Yeah, like I said, everyone's presented with opportunities, and every day we're presented with opportunities, and half the time we don't even know them. And I think it's being willing to take those opportunities and to take risks. The easy option for me when I was 21 was to become a development officer. It was a sport I knew I could have done that job, no problem. I felt I could have. I took the risk of going into a sector that I didn't really know much about, and we learn all the time, and the decisions we make today will help us with the decisions we make tomorrow. And I think that's the big thing, is be willing to take risks and don't be afraid to fail. And I think that's the key. Don't be afraid to fail, because that's how you learn. And as someone who has a psyche of being quite risk averse, that's something I have to tell myself all the time. Don't be afraid to fail. And if it doesn't work, do you know what? It doesn't matter. We'll learn from it and we'll move on. Maybe we'll try the same thing tomorrow, but let's not be afraid to fail. So that'd be my big advice to anybody going forward. Take risks and don't be afraid to fail.
Love that. I just want to say big thank you. I know we originally had this episode penciled in as episode number 4, so I don't know what we're up to now in the 80s. So big thank you. And also I wanted to say a thank you just on the record to, as I've probably mentioned a couple of times, but I went to university down in South Wales, and your family was always really supportive to me. Your sister, when she was at Sport Wales, helped me out with my first grant to start my first business. I got £750 from a community chest grant to get things going. So yeah, big shout out. And like with your dad as well, I know he's passed now, but really great kind of business advice as well when I was starting out. So I just wanted big thank you for you to coming on the show as well, mate.
No problem at all. I lent you a £5 back in 2006. You never gave it back. But we let it go.
Okay, end of the show.
An absolute pleasure. It's good to be able to finally get around to doing it. Yeah. I hope it lived up to expectations.
It was awesome, man. Thank you for listening to this week's show. You can subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can write to us at dryphase.podcast@coordinate.cloud, tweet us at Coordinate Sport, or follow us on Instagram at coordinate_sports, or on my account at James_Ventures. This episode was produced by Nancy Kwamboka, with support from Claire Goodchild and Lola Small, with special thanks to Rochelle. I'm James Moore, and you've been listening to The Drive Phase from Coordinate Sport.